So, good morning, everybody. My name is Niccolo Milanese. I'm attached to the Berggruen Institute here in Venice, Berggruen Institute Europe. And we're going to talk about the limits of planetary governance. You'll all know that Hegel said that reading the newspaper every morning is a realistic form of daily prayer. Here we are congregated on a Sunday morning to talk about the planetary. I don't know about you, reading the newspaper is rather a dismal affair these days. We're going to do our best to present a pragmatic and hopeful possibility, or set of possibilities for the planetary while acknowledging the limits of the current situation. We have an unparalleled group of people to do that with, who have a wealth of practical experience in global governance and international affairs, as well as theoretical reflections. The way we're going to go about it is that Mintu Pham is going to give some opening remarks in just a second, and then we will react to them each in our different ways and set up a conversation. And I want to ensure that we leave plenty of time also for a dialogue all together. So do think, as you are listening, of what it is you would want to ask or say, and I'll make sure that you have, some of you, the time to do so. So with those introductory remarks out of the way, I want to hand over to Mintu Pham. You have a great deal of experience in UN affairs, somebody who's tried to get things done in the system, and now, if I understand right, through consultancy with Project Starling, to find new forms of coalitions. Please open us up here.
Great, thank you so much, Niccolo, and I am very happy to be here. Good morning, everyone, on a bright Sunday morning. I'm co-founder and CEO of a new think and do tank with an emphasis on do, called Project Starling, which is based in New York, but we have folks working all over the globe. And our mission, our vision is essentially a multilateral system that works. And what we mean by that is a more egalitarian, multilateral, cooperative system that delivers for people and planet. And we believe the way to do that is to shift power to those who are most impacted by global crises. The issues that you heard yesterday, I think Nair Woods talked about how those who are most bearing the brunt of the crisis have the most at stake. And I think they really should be those who we elevate in the multilateral system. You just heard Nathan talk about our political moment. And I just wanted to dwell on that just for a second, because I think, even if right now nationalist populism doesn't lend itself to dealing with these planetary issues, something that Nils Gilman said yesterday about being prepared for the inconceivable to become possible. And I think conversations like this help to prepare us for success in a way, right? When the moment comes, when we do need a different way of governing the planet, what are the ideas? What are the regimes, the norms and principles, and the way of operating that we're going to then replace what we have right now? And if we don't prepare ourselves for success, I think we'll come to a moment where we say, hang on a second, we didn't realize this was going to happen so quickly, and then get ourselves even in a deeper mess. If you look at revolutions around the world, I have a dear friend who was working in Bangladesh for a long time trying to figure out how do we overcome some of the authoritarian tendencies in that country. And very quickly over the summer, as you saw, the government changed very, very quickly, and they were not prepared for success. And so how do we make sure, and conversations like this are really important. So what I wanted to talk today about was lessons that we can learn from essentially, so we don't have planetary governance, but I think what we do have is global governance of planetary issues. And I think there are some lessons that we can learn from that. And we should remember that global governance regimes and institutions are set up by humans. And so we have to find a way to reconcile our very human politics with our deep and long-standing 3.5 billion year hydrogen connection with the planetary in how we govern. And the good news is that we've actually done this. We have tried, through global governance of planetary issues, to address planetary problems. We have actually several decades of experience, and I thought we'd just draw on some insights from that. In terms of getting 193 governments around the world to agree on principles, norms, and agendas for how we address planetary issues, we have a few pretty decent examples. So first of all, in 2015, I'm not going to go all the way back, but just maybe more recently in the last decade or so. In 2015, we had the Paris Climate Agreement, which you've heard a lot about. You had also the agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals, which is essentially a way of looking at global development and ending extreme poverty in line with planetary boundaries. So how do we make sure that we're able to grow our economies and address development issues while not overstepping the bounds of the planet? In 2022, we had an agreement to develop a legally binding agreement to end plastic pollution. We also had the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in 2022, the High Seas Treaty, which was 10 years in the making to protect biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and that has 104 signatories at this point. And then even earlier this year, you had an updating of the legally binding international health regulations this past May. So what can we learn from these relatively successful examples? I think we often want to talk about all the negative aspects of international governance, but actually we've had these positive examples. So what did we learn? First, that I'd say we're actually moderately, we're decent at agreeing on norms and principles and getting the governments around the world to agree on that, even amid this very divided political environment. We're also pretty decent at following up on the technical solutions. So building standards, the science and the evidence as to what works to intervene and address these issues, and even developing the plumbing, which Nair Woods also mentioned yesterday. And what has actually made these examples successful? What can we learn from that? And when you look at the patterns, and my team and I have been trying to assess what are some common patterns across these examples. One is that there are non-governmental organizations and think tanks that have allied with developing countries who bear the brunt of global crises. These are the states that are dealing with climate change, dealing with really the worst of the COVID consequences. And they are states that have seats in the intergovernmental organizations that can make a difference, that are making decisions right now. And that oftentimes with states, with the support of think tanks and NGOs outside, there's sort of advocacy communities outside, scientific and others, who are directly supporting these states, you can actually get really good outcomes in the examples that I mentioned to you. Oftentimes you don't know that behind the scenes these alliances are happening, that scientists and academics and think tanks are directly providing analyses and evidence and even the cases and the talking points to these governments so that they can negotiate. But also the advocacy groups outside making noise, creating the mood music, and a lot of the pressure that gets governments to agree on these things. If you think about the Paris Agreement to cap global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. It was really led by the Marshall Islands, a teeny tiny state, especially when you think about global power. And yet they were able to build coalitions with other like-minded states. But it all happened because there were think tanks and NGOs and groups like those gathered here who directly supported them. And this example happened over and over again. I had deep experience, in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we built these coalitions to directly support governments who were trying to negotiate on behalf of the planet. And so essentially, I'm trying to look at, how do we draw from the practice and turn that into theory, into what Anne-Marie Slaughter, the mother of networked multilateralism, how we take that practice and really make it a reality and iterate that and experiment with it to see how we can improve on those networks to make global governance work better. Secondly, a lesson that we've learned is that while we might be successful in getting these agreements, we are, as Nils mentioned yesterday, failing to uphold those commitments. So as you've seen in Paris and even just yesterday, even if you had 300 billion new commitments, are those actually new? Is it additional to what we've already promised, or are we just going to recalculate and rename existing numbers? We haven't achieved or even gotten close to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I mentioned on the High Seas Treaty, you only have 104 signatories. That's some, but only a small fraction of those have actually ratified within their own governments. We are failing to uphold those political commitments. And each time we do, we are undermining faith in these international institutions. And so in a sense, these networks and the NGOs and the think tanks and the groups outside that I was talking about, do we have the discipline to then maintain, after we get an agreement, attention and energy on making sure that we, not just governments, are also helping to execute and deliver on those? Because each time we don't, we are undermining faith in these international institutions, and we provide fodder to those nationalist populists who want to withdraw from the international stage. And so with that, let me just hand it back over, but I'm really excited to pursue these questions with you all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mintu. Pascal Lamy, what is your reaction? And perhaps the overarching question is, what is stopping us from getting it done?
Well, I'm a bit like Nari was yesterday morning. My area of expertise is global governance, European governance, so I'm a bit lost in the country of planetarism. But I'm willing to do the journey because I share two of the premises of this whatever planetary realism thinking. First, and that's my direct answer to your question, because we have to reconceptualize our collective, because we are lost and it doesn't work. And second, because I agree that there is a difference between global and planetary, in that we have to consider in this sort of new collective many systems which interact with the human system and which the human system interacts with. So we need a much larger scope of disciplines. This being said, I'm not sure at this stage that this planetary concept will make the problems we have with the present governance easier. And listening to yesterday's debate, yesterday night, I came to the conclusion that it probably would make it harder. Now, why? First, what do we expect from governance? The old theory, leadership, legitimacy, coherence, which is the sort of theory of international organizations, plus two elements which appeared in the discussion yesterday, which is create a feeling that we are in control. That has to be part of the equation. And second, it has to provide a narrative for the future. So let's put the global governance, the governance equation in these very simple terms. What is absolutely clear, and I'm not in line with you on this, you know that, we've had discussed that before, that the present multilateral system delivers. It does not, but I go further. It cannot deliver. And we have an excellent example of that in this picture which we've had considering since yesterday, which is the ocean. I spend a lot of my time on the ocean now for a variety of reasons. We have a myriad of institutions. We have a myriad of treaties. We have a myriad of organizations, including, by the way, recently adopted BBNG, which I'm campaigning day after day so that it's ratified before the next UN conference. So we have the full setup of a multilateral system, and it does not work. If there's one thing which everybody agrees on, which is that this enormous ecosystem for the planet is degrading every day and every day and every day. So why doesn't it work? My experience, and I spend quite a bit of time in the machine room of the international system, is very simple. Sovereignty, the nation state. And in listening to both Nils and Nathan this morning, you still have a big problem with the nation state. The nation state stands in the way of effective multilateralism because sovereigns, by definition, can do what they want. So they accept to enter or not into obligations, disciplines. And the moment you have 200 of these as part of the system, the experience is that it does not work. They don't provide coherence, they don't provide leadership by construction. Who's the leader? There's no leader. Who's the one that says, oh, you should do this trade-off to remain coherent? Nobody does that. And we know that legitimacy, which exists at the level of nation state, is not transmissible to international organizations. The problem, and it appeared nicely yesterday, is that the nation states remain the main anthropological system of belonging. So what do you do with the belonging issue? And we heard yesterday, why does it work? Because there are borders. People know where they are, even more than local or global. So you need to factor in this belonging. And I think going to the planetary, as long as you don't create some sort of planetary belonging, you will be facing the same problem. So for the moment, and that's where I am for the moment, we have decided in creating the Paris Peace Forum to test what we call polylateralism. So we move away from the inter/national system between nations, not without them, but we go elsewhere, and we work with major stakeholders of the international systems, which may not be nation states. There may be cities. We've got plenty of cities on this planet who are much more important than 2/3 of the voters in the UN General Assembly. NGOs, major businesses, major academic institutions, which now have a big say on a lot of our problems, and we create purpose-led coalitions. So we sort of circumvent this necessity of a belonging, which I totally recognize. I would never accept to be governed by something with which I don't have a sense of belonging. And by the way, political preferences are always articulated around this. So we circumvent the belonging, and we replace the political energy that goes with that by a sense of common purpose. A coalition, a purpose-led coalition to try and get something done, like surrounding the Antarctica with marine protected areas. Of course we have a BBNG, but I've been working on that for the last 10 years. The moment you cannot overcome the objections of China and Russia to overfish around the southern Atlantic, the Southern Ocean, which is in deep danger because the ice is melting, you can do nothing. We have to try and move the Chinese civil society, if there's something like that. We have to build a coalition of the willing. So that's, I believe, for the moment, the way we go. How do we articulate this with a wider concept, such as the planetary, I think, is an open question for this discussion.
Super, thank you. Frank Biermann, what's the perspective of someone who's been working with Earth system theory and so has a custom of working with complexity and doesn't see complexity necessarily as a challenge, but rather an acknowledgement of the real situation, perhaps?
Good. I mean, just following up, first of all, I mean, just thanks for the organizers. Fantastic being here. And for me also, great, I mean, to see so many people who are so involved and so interested in thinking about the planet, especially in these kind of difficult times. I think it's really, I take a lot of energy of these presentations and of talking to everybody. I have set up 20 years ago the Earth System Governance Project, which is a large research network where we also have annual conferences, which are a little bit like here. They're a little bit bigger. They're more based on papers and presentations. The question is, what is the difference between Earth system governance and planetary governance here? And my conclusion on that level is it's actually pretty much the same. There are different trajectories. I mean, the planetary comes maybe more from the humanities, while the Earth system governance theory comes more from the Earth system science, but they have the same core idea, the Anthropocene, a planet that is fundamentally reshaped by people. And talking about our experiences and also following up of these discussions and taking the privilege of being one of the first to speak today, I would like to also open up the entire discussion today a little bit broader. I think today, the last discussions yesterday were very much focused on ideas of effectiveness. It's more or less about problems to fix them. How can we resolve problems? How can we get down the emissions? I would like to have a larger debate also that brings in concerns, number one, of equity and justice, which I think is fundamental when we discuss issues of Earth system transformation, planetary change. Justice and equity are very, very important. If we talk about how can we live on this planet in the future, which is the core of the discussions yesterday, we really have to also keep in mind that 700 million people woke up this morning, had not enough food. So for many people, this is a day, today and this week, where the planet is not enough for them already. And we have to take this into account. When we talk about planetary institutions, planetary governance, Earth system governance, we have to think about issues of planetary justice at the same time. And this is what we try to do also in the Earth System Governance Project, where we have a task force on planetary justice, where we try to unpack these concepts and try to find solutions which I believe are fundamental also to address issues of multilateralism, polylateralism, and all these changes. And number two, which I think is also very important to bring in these debates, when we think about planetary institutions, planetary governance, planetary organizations maybe at some point, as they have been mentioned in the book of Niels and Jonathan, which I really recommend for everybody to read. I mean, I hope everybody has read it at this conference, but if you haven't read it yet, do it on the flight back. But I think one point is when we think about these planetary level institutions, democracy becomes very important. I mean, who is governing? Who is taking decisions in planetary scale institutions? Who is really taking it? I mean, I sometimes compared with the cockpit of Captain Kirk. That's kind of the standard idea that there's a cockpit and there's a Captain Kirk who happens to be male white American anyway. So, but is this kind of the model? It's not the model. We have to find different models of democratic governance beyond the nation state for the planet, for the Earth system. And that's a fundamental challenge. I think we need to have solutions for that. And that leads also to the question of power. Because right now, not every person on the planet has the same influence on planetary developments. If you're born in the Netherlands, where I'm based, the Dutch have, on average, much more influence on the planetary development than a person in Africa, for example. It's linked to the consumption, it's linked to the power of the countries, it's linked to wealth, it links to many other factors. And that is not democratic. And if we are moving forward into the direction of planetary institutions, Earth system governance, planetary organizations even, then we have to find solutions and have to create them in a way that are democratic. And I think this is a fundamental challenge. I don't have any answer to this, but I'm looking forward to audience points and that level in a sense. So the point is, how can we create planetary effective institutions at the planetary scale beyond the nation state? We can discuss the nation state a bit more in this panel maybe, but in a way that also takes into account principles of planetary justice and planetary democracy at the same time. So I would really like that also this panel and the other panels are engaging in these questions, which I think are very important from an ethical perspective, but I think they're also very important from the perspective of effectiveness, because you will never get effective planetary institutions that are not based on principles of justice and not based on principles of democracy, because you will have permanent conflicts, and you will never get this idea of a planetary consciousness, a planetary demos in a sense, if it's not based on justice and on democracy. Whatever this is a nice question for the discussion.
Thanks very much, Frank. Stephanie Sherman, we are talking about planetary governance, and that perhaps suggests a distinction between governance and politics. And politics, as perhaps we were just hearing, can be quite a messy affair. So I wonder if there's any scope for dealing with some aspects of the problems from a governance approach.
Sure. Well, I'll pick up a little bit on what Nathan was talking about this morning in terms of the role of technologies in contributing to this, and also what Mintu was saying about how we prepare for this shift. So I'm Stephanie Sherman. Great to be here and to be here with all of you in conversation about this incredibly important topic. And I'm strategy director of a program at the Berggruen Institute called Antikythera, and we focus on the philosophy of technology and the challenges and opportunities of planetary scale computation. And one of the distinctions that we make inside the program is between the political, which we think about as the kind of public performance of negotiating decision, and governance, which we think about more specifically as the mechanisms by which governance occurs. So thinking about this in terms of governance in the cybernetic sense of governor or steerage. And I recently contributed an essay to BI Press's new book on the planetary. If you haven't seen it, it's really an object to behold. It's a lovely gradient here, so congratulations to everyone at the press for the first piece. And the piece that I wrote is focused on the idea of planetary platform automation. And the essay sort of looks at the ways that the evolution of the environment is itself, in the eyes of Bucky Fuller, if you've read Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, already itself a form of automation. And that while automation started as a form of biological scaffolds, which is what Sarah Walker would kind of, the term she would use if she was here, it's also now evolving into technospheric ones and biotechnical ones. And so we should maybe see automation as a process whereby decisions that were once up for debate get determined and resolved and embedded into environments themselves. So this includes both hardwares and softwares that both platform possibilities but also preclude them. And they serve as regulatory mechanisms that enable or preclude access, interoperability, and interconnection. And there's not much time to get into all the fine details here, but the general idea that I'd like to kind of contribute to this is not to consider automation as the replacement or substitution of human labor, but as part of a cascade of protocols, delegated decisions, and continued encasings that are continually evolving, and that we steer so that eventually we might no longer have to. So I was thinking about actually the prompt of the limits of planetary governance, and I was thinking about this in two different kinds of ways. So first, what are the limits of planetary governance within the current configurations of the political and governance systems we have now? And then maybe what are also the limits of planetary governance in general, as in what kind of things governance can and cannot do fundamentally as a system itself. And this includes questions of how, as Nils might prompt, any governance system, automated or not, can be built to account for protections against mistakes, aberrations, and bad actors, as well as be mobilized or catalyzed to realize its potential. And as we well know, that happens whether it's in democratic systems or automated ones. So I would argue that many, but certainly not all, of the planetary challenges we face today would be well served by the integration of the data insights of artificial intelligence at mathematical and computational scales that human brains aren't always privy to or capable of incorporating into the decision-making processes that we have. And that an intelligent or intentional process of automating certain processes and decisions should be a welcome part of our aspirations of realizing planetary resilience. And this isn't to downplay the important questions you've brought up, Frank, of how resources get distributed, who benefits and how we protect against risk. But it does challenge the paradigm of conversation about how this might be best achieved and potentially existential downsides of not automating certain aspects of the planetary project. So all of this is to say that when we think about planetary viability or persistence, we need to factor in how emerging technologies such as AI, protocols for regulation, prediction, decision, and evaluation can help us get out of our current predicament, since human beings already seem to be at a stalemate with current models, and our utopian narratives about human control are overridden by both democratic decisions and those of nation states, which all have also proved to be massive communication, education, and coordination problems. And it's also kind of a provocation to get beyond the binaries, models that we might use to tend to think about automation as either a centralized model or a decentralized model, and that's really no longer a useful heuristic, that we really need a hybrid of understanding how these two pieces might be configured to formulate a potentially useful provocation. And so finally, just to conclude, I guess, and to answer your question, Niccolo, it's maybe a question of how one considers the relationship between politics and governance, whether politics is actually downwind of governance or whether governance is downwind of politics, and that might be one of the considerations that we might want to explore.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. Now, I'm also a philosopher by disposition, so I'm going to try and say a couple of simple things to you about space and time. But I tell you, I will try to be as concrete as I can. Look, here's the point about space. One of the things that I find most pernicious about the global imaginary is a kind of pyramid structure, which goes from local to global. The basic idea is that if you put together enough localities, you get a nation, and you put together the nations, you get the global, and somewhere in the sky, so the ground is down here at the local level, and the global is somewhere up here at the top, and the question is sort of who is the emperor, or who gets to stand and commands this great pyramid. It is actually rather similar, I would suggest, to a Ponzi scheme, rather than a pyramid, in as much as the latecomers to this kind of conceptualization may buy into it and realize that the early arrivals have already taken all of their assets. Because the more one thinks about the unit of the local, and we've been talking about it over the last day, the more one realizes that it's a kind of abstraction, that all of our systems of living are deeply imbricated in networks and webs which constantly expand and overpass territorial boundaries that we might attempt to draw around them. And so even if for certain purposes, drawing circumscriptions, most obviously for defense, might be of importance, it should not be the only way that we conceptualize and organize our planetary affairs. And so perhaps one of the things we need to try to do is to collapse the hierarchy, collapse the scales into each other. And that seems to me one of the things that has come out already of this conversation, that in dealing with specific issues effectively can require bringing together governments, local governments, NGOs, businesses, local people, all sorts of scales working together rather than drawing strict hierarchies and orders between them. We stay on our planet all at the same level and find solutions together. So that is the point about space. Now, a couple of points about time. One is that it's a platitude to say that we're living in a moment of great change, but the change is experienced very differently by different people, and people have different capacities to deal with the change. And a crucial aspect that I think we have to think about in thinking about planetary governance is how do we introduce enough predictability and stability for people to be able to plan their lives, for businesses to be able to plan their activities as we go through a transition. Because if one doesn't build in predictability and some degrees of stability, it will be the most powerful actors who have the capacity to change. They can reorganize themselves every day, and those with the least assets will find that they are losing out. And it seems to me that one of the interesting things in what Stephanie was saying about automating some aspects of planetary governance is also to introduce something which is taken out of the tumult of constant renegotiation, and it introduces some basis of legitimate expectations that there will be clean drinking water. We have a system to manage that. There will be clean air, and other sorts of basic common goods are guaranteed. Second and last from me point about time is the following, that it was mentioned yesterday the importance of the way in which we sort of set up these discussions, the narrative that we use. And this speaks to me to something which is a feature of Berggruen Institute activities, which is to acknowledge that also the cultural, the imaginative dimension is actually essential to how it is these political problems present themselves. And so being attentive to the narrative and the rhetoric we use is an aspect of that. And the aspect that I want to insist upon is that we have a tendency in Western politics to do one of two things. Either to see all of politics as a kind of morality play, which is a kind of ongoing battle between good and evil, like some sort of medieval performance. Or, if we get out of that morality standpoint, to fall back on the narrative structure of tragedy. And in particular, when it comes to talking about planetary affairs, the tragic mindset is very attractive to us because we anticipate a kind of collapse or calamity, and we position ourselves as the actor who has some way been responsible, despite ourselves through our hubris in bringing about that calamity. And we find ourselves, like Hamlet or like Oedipus, paralyzed because past, present, and future have collapsed in front of us, and we are in a state of what I would call temporal paralysis and cognitive vertigo, which was a feeling that I had at various points yesterday listening to these vast scales. So, and all of this may sound rather like literary theory, but I do think that in setting up spaces of planetary governance, we have to try and speak and talk in a way and narrate the collective endeavor in a way which is about extending the possible future. And that is something that was brought up in the last panel yesterday. And so instead of a kind of morality play with a final triumph of good or tragedy in which there is a collapse, what we are trying to focus on is extending the range of possible livable futures. And that is a different kind of narrative endeavor. It's one where we might find resources in the tradition of metamorphosis, for example, where there's no clear beginning and there's no clear end. There is just transformation, and it's imbricated and connected and multi-species and all the rest of it, if one is hearing of it in my words. So I wanted to say that about time as well. So those were my simple-minded philosophical remarks. I want to pick up on some of the things that have been sort of thrown out here as challenges to us. Most obviously, the challenge around legitimacy, and I think the challenge about justice is a really important term that you brought to us, Frank. And sitting here in Venice, in what could be described as a privileged position, I think turning our minds to questions of justice and just distribution across the planet is perhaps a worthy thing to do on a Sunday morning. So on those 2 points, how do we ensure legitimacy? What does planetary justice mean?
All right. I totally subscribe to the fact that human organizations must have as a purpose to properly distribute resources, resources capacity to accomplish. But this is very specific to human systems. If the planetary, which I agree with, is the way to connect these human systems with other systems, and notably natural systems, we are on 2 very different grounds. Biological systems have homeostasis. They produce natural homeostasis. Human systems do not produce homeostasis at all. They usually provide the contrary. They provide a sort of chaos or disorder. And the only way they can provide homeostasis, and in my view, justice, democracy, are part of what we could say a human system has produced its own homeostasis, are artificial. They are not natural. They are artificial. And by the way, the best evidence that they are artificial is that they go through fictions, like the nation state, which is pure fiction, like a currency, which is a pure fiction, like a god, which is a pure fiction. So how do we bring this nearer to the other systems, I think, is a big, big issue. And from what I've read, and I've done my homework, reading both books, I would like the Berggruen Institute to create a third book, which would be about the anthropology of planetarism. We need this anthropological approach, which is the one that goes through the fictions societies have invented to belong to something, to have a story, to have a narrative. And unless we do that, we will not connect human systems which work on artificial homeostasis with natural homeostasis. And I think this connection is absolutely crucial. Now, let me add, I hope I have got something of an answer to your question. Let me add one point about the multilateral system, and it came to my mind both listening to you and listening to Nathan earlier this morning. When you spoke about green nationalism, you put your finger on the main regression of the multilateral system which we've had, which is the Paris Agreement. I'm a big fan of the Paris Agreement. It was some sort of tipping point in the conscience of the problem, but the way this thing is constructed is a regression from multilateralism. Why do we have green nationalism? Because the Paris Agreement says you have to provide nationally determined contributions. And nationally determined contributions inevitably lead to green nationalism. And by the way, to zillions of problems of how do you articulate these different trajectories with different timelines, with different instruments, with different policies. And by the way, we have the result of that in this very complex mess of trade and environment and development issues. So we've already started going back from your love of multilateralism, which I believe does not work well, but in so doing 10 years ago, we started deconstructing. The normal approach would have been, we have a climate problem, we need not to trespass 1.5, and I agree that the coalition that did this was a very efficient one. I was part of that, by the way. But we should have logically said, we have a carbon budget to do that, and this is the multilaterally determined contribution which the US, China, Europe, XYZ will do. 10 years ago, we refused to do that. So we already were, in a way, backstepping on whatever sort of multilateralism. I'll go back later, if I may, on the possible solution for the ocean.
So just, thank you. No, I fully agree that the multilateral system doesn't work in an ideal sense of this is what we should do, and then why aren't we doing that? I mean, I think, Kofi Annan and actually Dag Hammarskjöld said that the UN is not there to bring us to heaven, it's to save us from hell, and even then we're not very good at saving ourselves from hell. But that doesn't mean that we throw out the entire thing because we have no other choice. We are humans with complex ways of thinking about problems. We approach an issue from our own, unfortunately, self-centered and self-interested or nationally, interested positions. And so when you look at something like the Paris Climate Agreement, I remember I was in the UN at the time, and or as we were thinking about what came out of Copenhagen, which was the COP, before that, or a bit before that, and then leading into how we get a real climate agreement. And it wasn't going to be legally binding. It wasn't going to be a treaty. because governments weren't there. And this tension we've talked about for the last 2 days about sovereignty, national interests, and then what we would ideally like to see is there. What do we do about it? We can't wildly imagine ourselves out of that in the immediate. Yes, we can maybe in the longer term, and hope that at some point we have a different conception of identity where we say we have a planetary identity and then want to work towards that. I kind of think about that 1968 photograph from the Apollo space mission of the Earth suspended in the blackness of space, and suddenly people around the planet saying, oh, actually, we are much more delicate than we thought we are. We are all on this thing suspended out there together, and that was sort of a unifying moment. Now, we haven't been able to capture that and do much with it, but that was really important. But short of that, what do we have? We have the system that we have. And so if you're talking about how do we then get to the immediate issues of addressing planetary problems, what we have right now are those who have the greatest stake, who are already bearing the brunt of this. How do we support their perspectives? Because they are the ones carrying the torch in a way, or they should be, even if they don't have the capacity. I mean, you put the Marshall Islands or any other small government or less empowered government next to the US and the Chinas of the world, and there's just, it's an asymmetry of power. And so how do you then equalize that, or at least try to approximate that so that we can address, I'm a pragmatist, how we address the challenges that we're dealing with right now. And the way that I see through it is to say, okay, the system that we have right now, there are those who have a seat at the table. They don't have a seat in the G20, they don't have a seat in the G7, they don't have a seat in the international financial institutions, but they do have a seat in the universal setting of the United Nations. So how do you then build the coalitions of those states, and there's a lot of them, in fact, they outnumber the major powers, and you say, how do we support them? Because their interests at the end of the day are about the planetary, are about the things that we care about. And then elevate those perspectives, give them the evidence and the analysis and the advocacy and the heft of the greater publics who do see this greater conception of identity to then get what we need out of that. And it's not just getting the agreement, because I agree with you. The Paris Climate Agreement are just words on a piece of paper. All of these agreements are just words on a paper. How do you turn that into action? And this is where the politics has to begin. We often, especially those, excuse me, like me, I keep doing that. We often think that the end game is once you have that agreement and you're done, right? This is what negotiators, diplomats, I've been in that world for a long time. You do, and then you think, okay, great. It's like, Congress signing off on but that is just the beginning, because then you actually have to put teeth to it. And this is where we often fail, because we then think, going back to defaulting into national sovereignty, it's then up to the governments to deliver on those promises we got them to sign on to. And it is not. And in fact, as Nathan was talking about this morning, you then have to, especially in an environment where the national mood is not to then cooperate internationally. You have to go to local and subnationals. You also have to go to the private sector and the networks of think tanks and NGOs and corporations and everybody else out there who do care about this. How do you mobilize them for the long term? And it really does take a lot of discipline, and conversations like this help us nudge in that direction, but you really have to do that, because at the end of the day, states will only agree to what they agree on. Nationally determined contributions in Paris is what killed it, but it's the only thing that we were able to get at the time. Would we rather not have a Paris, or would we rather have a Paris that's not legally binding, but we have a signal or a norm that we've agreed on? So to this point about automation, which I think is really interesting, I'm not a technologist, but I try to dabble in it, but I think that the perspective that you're bringing here, which is how do we set standards so that then when something happens, the light switch is turned, and then you say, okay, automatically, if you name something, if you determine, so I'm just going to use an old example from World War II, after World War II, but we labeled genocide as being the decimation, which is 1/10 of a population, right? We defined it. Raphael, we defined what genocide was, so that then when it happens, it's measurable and you can kick in all of the different actions that then happen. That's the automation you're talking about, right? But what have we seen happen? When we try to define something on a global stage, we create a norm around it, we do something, we say this is legally binding. It's still then up to people and the institutions that people run to then uphold that. And that is where we have continually failed. Automation may work, but then we will always backtrack and say, well, actually, that's not the definition, or we'll undermine what was the back end that got us to that automated. So there's something there that I think automation will only, we can have the ideal of you automatically decide that something's gonna happen, but it's not gonna sustain itself unless we keep the pressure on and we keep that discipline of effort and energy.
Thanks. Frank?
Well, I can just pick up on some of these points, very important. I mean, just your point about space, and I think that is one of the problems is this pyramid model that many people have in their mind. And just translating this into political science terms, I mean, the idea that there is this cockpit emerging, there is a chance, a possibility of having these institutions as planetary scale, which you might have at some point. I don't want to rule it out. I would even like it in a sense, breaking the nation state. But many people expect this to be, and it won't happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years. I think this kind of fantasy of having planetary scale effective institutions is harming a lot of debate because there's so much hope is being placed in this idea. It's the same with the cops. When you talk to journalists, in a sense, there's always this imagination that a COP is solving the world. I mean, people are gathering prime ministers and presidents and kings and whoever. I mean, they're not even coming these days anymore. They're coming to Baku, and suddenly in 1 week the world will be a better place. And this is not how it works. And I think this fantasy of having this pyramid system is one of the problems, and we have to move forward. And there I agree also with Pascal, with his ideas about polylateralism in small, nimble, smart coalitions, novel kind of coalitions, work forward in a very pragmatic way. And this is what I call planetary pragmatism. Having the large vision, of course, vision of transformation of the entire Earth system, but acting in novel, smaller, a little bit more modest coalitions of countries, non-state actors, moving forward and taking into account, taking my earlier point, of course, again, take into account planetary equity, justice, and planetary democracy. It should not be small coalitions of the powerful that are kind of fixing the planet for the rest of the world. That's not what we want. It has to be somewhat democratic, somehow just to move forward. A second point, also picking up your other point about time. I think that's a fundamental problem for political science. Human societies are based on human governments of societies is based on very, very short periods of time. Election cycles are 4 years, attention cycles are 1 week maybe in these days. And we have to govern the entire planetary system for centuries. And that's one of the biggest conclusions of the planetary debate, of the Anthropocene debate. We are dealing with responsibilities that date back hundreds of years, and we are dealing with challenges that will be around us for hundreds of years. So we are kind of the generation in the middle, resolving the problems caused by our ancestors and kind of trying to fix the planet for our children, grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a big problem for political science and for politics, how to deal with that in the current political system. And just to give one example, with Friedrich Harnisch, who must be somehow in the audience here, a couple of years ago, we developed a paper together on long-term institutions. We want to know, have there been organizations in human history that were lasting for hundreds of years, for thousands of years? And we found some of them. We found a Japanese company that was in business, a family business, for 1,500 years. And then it went bankrupt actually recently. So anyway, that's a family business. And then, of course, you can imagine also the Catholic Church, for example. We are in Italy. I mean, it's also technically 2,000 years of stable leadership transition in a way. The Japanese Imperial House, and a couple of others. We found some other companies. We found a cricket club that was around for many hundred years. The problem with these organizations is if you want to learn from them, you don't want to learn from them because they're all based on elitist decision-making, male-based. I mean, you don't want to run the planet like a, I mean, I wouldn't mention Catholic Church, but I mentioned, at least I mentioned this Japanese private company that was really from father to the son, to the son, to the son, to the son. This is not how we want to run long-term planetary problems. These are not the organizations we want to have. But what else can we do? What other principles are available? For example, when we talk about carbon dioxide removal, one of the big solutions, Pascal has written about it, that are sometimes being offered, if you take out carbon, you have to keep it under the ground. I mean, that's the idea. It should never be emitted again. You need to have long-term institutions that are dealing with it. How are we govern this? How we set up an institution that is running after our lifetime and way hundreds of years. Big challenge, and we don't have that much. But it comes then also to the point of Stephanie. It's more, I want to pick up the delegation point. And that's an interesting point also from the political perspective. Is there any scope of delegating decisions to other mechanisms? I wouldn't say technocratic, maybe automatic, I wouldn't say either for political purposes. But I think, for example, that is the banks. I mean, we have delegated decisions on currencies to central banks. I mean, there's a target, whatever 2% inflation target, and this is more or less outside, depending on which country you're from, more or less outside the political decision-making in parliament. There's always some influence, of course, but essentially the idea was taking outside the daily business of politicians, parliaments, elections, etc., have it delegated to organization, in this case a bank, that is only focusing on one quantitative targets. The same is, in a way, delegation of law that was mentioned, norms, to courts. And that is why we have this huge wave of climate litigation these days, which is extremely effective. It's maybe even one of the most effective developments in climate policy these days, especially like in the Netherlands, in a sense, I mean, where our NGOs have sued the government for not doing enough on climate policy, and it works. I mean, it's not 100% ideal. I mean, nothing is ideal in these worlds, no, but the government takes it seriously. The government really has understood we lost the law case, and we have to do something, so it's not to be ignored. The court has a power, the court has a function, and that is, again, a delegation of a planetary objective, a planetary goal. In this case, also, it was linked to the IPCC, it was linked to the Paris Agreement. So this is the normative standards that have been taken up by a court. And this was originally the first case. It was a local judge sitting in The Hague without any experience, just a very simple judge, got the case, whatever, climate against government of Netherlands, more or less, no? And took a decision. And that is a way of delegation that I find very interesting, and that gives also the power of the Paris Agreement, which is then the NDCs are not really binding in a sense, but the ideas of 2 degree, 1.5 degree are important because they can enter through the delegation to the legal system our political decision-making process. Another point what could be interesting would be youth, for example. There are discussions about bringing youth in constitutional systems and giving them more rights, giving them more possibilities, having a youth council that can maybe override decisions of the elder, in a sense, I mean, those who have been around for quite some time, and having more power to young people in a constitutional setting. I would find this a fascinating idea. There's experimentation, but this was just picking up your point of delegation. Thank you.
Great. I think response. Yeah, and Frank, we had such a great conversation in the hall, and I just kept saying, well, explain to me what justice is in your eyes. Like, what does this actually mean? And we spoke about that it means the distribution and potential, the mobilization of resources. I mean, in more or less, and we can think about all the ways that automated systems have supported that process in ways that have been both incredibly constructive and detrimental. But I also really appreciate what you're contributing to this question, Pascal, because that maybe the mechanism to do that is more through a project basis that kind of cuts across the ways that you're talking about, Nicolo. It's not this like, we need to mobilize local resources and then that'll like scale up in a kind of modeling to planetary way, that it's actually the projects which can enable and mobilize this justice mechanism. I also think the questions, Mintu, you're asking about maintenance are potentially the ones that are most exciting for automation, because even though we certainly want and need humans to be part of the processes of intervening and overseeing to some degree or intervening, it's also the case that as humans, we're perhaps the most bored by maintenance processes. And this is something that, whether it's on an individual scale or a much larger scale, building in maintenance protocols that can leverage these kind of technological tools might be ways that we can flag up and predict kind of ways that we're veering off course or not abiding by certain kinds of things, so that there might actually be a stronger role to play for maintenance. And then just to come back to your thought about legitimacy and Pascal's comment about belonging, which I think is really astute, is that it seems that the crisis of legitimacy that we're seeing really has to do a lot of ways between the schism between words and action. Like this is kind of what the whole democratic crisis in the United States is all about, is that there's narratives on one side and then there's the inability to act on another. And so just to bring it back to how we actually maintain the connection between those things seems like actually the project at hand, that we want to find ways to overcome the limits of the current governance systems that we have.
Thanks. I want to open it up in a second, so to give time for you to think of questions and for some microphones to be prepared, I'll just say again something about time, because something which came to mind around the justice question and some of the things that were mentioned is the debate about reparations. And that would be an example of where I think that making the discussion about opening up the future and prolonging the future takes it out to some extent of a kind of morality play setup and talks and can position reparations in terms of climate transition funds and other kinds of creating other kinds of infrastructure that are going to be necessary to prolong a livable planet. And so moving the emphasis to a future-oriented discussion and out of a kind of tragic predicament is not a way of escaping justice, it's a way of reframing it in potentially pragmatically but also ontologically more just and effective terms. So that said, I can now see somebody has a mic, and so we're all ready. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. One word that has not been mentioned, I think, during this entire conference so far is the word capitalism.
What was that?
I'm, you know, I sort of channel my inner Marxist here, but wondering whether or not the panel has any reflections on not just the limits of current planetary governance, but possibilities of current planetary governance, given the nature of the world economy, the incentives of private corporations, obscene levels of inequality we see in the world, not just north-south, but obviously both within the north and within the south. Be interested to think about what the panel thinks about the dynamics of that and growth models and sort of beyond GDP aspects of things when we think about limits of the planetary. Thanks.
Very good. There's a question over here. Can we try and get on this side? Is there another mic, or is there just one mic? There's another mic arriving to you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, lovely to hear so much talk about equity and justice. As an environmental lawyer, that makes me deeply happy. What makes me deeply worried is we talk about these as if they are naturally appealing to powerful states. They're not. They're principles of resistance to power, both domestically and internationally. So acceptability to states, and powerful states in particular, is going to be subject to a lot of the same roadblocks that we have with sovereignty more generally, as is accepting court jurisdiction on this. I suppose my question is, if we can be a bit more granular and look at tools, we can actually see coalitions of particularly developing countries where numbers are a source of alternative power rather than capitalism, driving change. So the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment is a great example where the Human Rights Council had lots of seats for developing nations, and the whole debate there was dominated by the developing world and shaped what went to the General Assembly. The slightly diluted version we get at the General Assembly was actually less diluted than we might expect. Is this an area where the polycentricity and the cross-cutting issues that we find at the heart of planetary governance might give us spaces like that, where there's opportunity in areas of law that are perhaps better developed or more functional in some ways than multilateral environmental agreements?
Thanks. I'd say one more before we go, or maybe two more before we come back. There's one at the back there.
Hi, I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about the recently held UN Summit for the Future a couple of months ago, where the majority of member states agreed to, or they pledged to represent future generations in their legislature, and also anchor things like foresight capabilities in the member state. Yeah.
Thanks. And one more that was over here, and then we'll come back.
given what Mr. Lamy said about the nation state standing in a way of a governance system that would better take into account the planetary dimension, I would like to ask you whether you think regional integration initiatives, such as the European Union, are useful training rooms for two reasons. First, for individuals to rethink a bit their political belonging, but also to find new mechanisms to reconciliate the democratic principles, one person, one vote, right? But also, I think the understandable fear of smaller groups to be outnumbered by like more populous groups. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So let's come back. There was capitalism, justice, future, and EU as a model.
What was the last one?
It was about whether the EU could be a model for how to deal with various issues around small states, big states, multilateralism. We don't know who might be able to deal with these.
So let me take capitalism, the future generations, and the EU. Of course, capitalism is the only serious system of global governance we have, short of what we are all trying to get to. That's, I think, the reality. And I've been in zillions of debates about globalization, and most of the time, I've been saying, like the Chinese proverb, don't look at the finger, look at the moon. The finger is globalization, the moon is capitalism. Most of the problems we have with globalization are the problems of capitalism, which is why we need a system to harness, rein in capitalism, short of something different, which so far has not really worked. So I totally agree. That's the structure we have and which we need to govern. We need to build a higher power than the one it exercises in the economic system of today. On the future and generation, I totally agree. I once participated in Oxford Martin School, big commission, which was called Now for the Long Term, where, and I was thinking about this in listening to Frank, we proposed to give a double vote to young people. The only problem being, what's the threshold? That's a delicate issue. Now, for the ocean, for instance, I have a sort of planetary solution, which is at least to give a voice to the ocean. And the idea would be, you take one wise old man or woman per continent, and all continents have their ocean issues, problems, and it's only one ocean, and you entrust them with speaking for the ocean. So they will not be the ones who decide, but they will be the ones that say, this is my problem, this is what I need. This is what you should do for me as a major ecosystem. And this connects with the EU governance. In one sense, the EU governance cannot be a predictor, contrary to what Jean Monnet said when he said integrating Europe is the first step towards the organization of tomorrow's world, which was his own words. No. Because this is based on a false anthropological assumption, which is that economic integration leads to political integration. This does not work. There is a barrier of species between the worker, the consumer, the economic agent, and a citizen, on the one side. So we have to dig we Europeans into this problem, which for the moment we have not really been coping with. There is, and we are back to the belonging, there is an imagination of the belonging, which is not yet there in the European system. We have a democratic deficit, which is not with the kratos, but with the demos, basically. And many of you in this room know that. Yet, there is something that needs to be retained, which is that we have created an institution who speaks for the general interest of the Union and for the future, which is the EU Commission. This is the real secret of the governance jump, of the jump in technology governance in the European Union. And remember this secret of the center of the Treaty of Rome, which is that if the EU Commission puts a proposal on the table, its mission to be to express the general interest of the Union beyond its member states, it can only be changed without the assent of the Commission by a unanimity of member states. I'm sorry to enter into this little technical detail, but this is the tabernacle of the Treaty of Rome. So I think what we have to retain is the notion that something, somebody, somewhere has to speak for the general interest, has to be entrusted with this is what we collectively need to do. This is my duty, this is what you've entrusted me to do. You decide, but I'm telling you what we should do. And this is, I think, something which is absolutely connected to this notion of planetary governance. Somebody has to speak for these systems.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to respond to a couple of the great questions here. Whoever just in the very back, hard to see you, raised the Summit of the Future. Thank you. I meant to also talk about that in my remarks. So 2 months ago, on the sidelines of the high-level week of the UN General Assembly, 193 governments came together to agree on a pact for the future. Essentially, heads of state at a summit agreed to renew multilateral cooperation in something called the Pact for the Future. And a very important element of that was a declaration on future generations. So the gentleman in the back mentioned the commitment that governments made in September to essentially take into account the interests and rights of future generations. And this happened among 193 countries at the UN. Now you can say, you know, we are still a very Westphalian state-based system, but that agreement essentially came about because there were deep thinkers in and around global governance who said, unless we can take into account the decisions that we're making today and the impact that's going to have on future generations, we won't have a planet that we want to be living on anymore. And they were able to, over the course of the last few years, get this idea of our commitment to future generations into the discussions at the global level among diplomats who don't think about these things. In fact, the first time they heard about this, a lot of them thought, is this about technology? Is this about AI? But it was about essentially, you know, the issues we've been talking about the last couple of days. So yes, the multilateral system is very slow to move, but you can actually impact it. Now, it is just words on a piece of paper about a commitment to future generations. But then this is where we have to make it real. How do we build in foresight thinking, I think you had mentioned, into the ways that these institutions and in the ways that we think about the decisions that we're making? How do we look further into the future as to what the threats and challenges are going to be, and then account for that as we're going through? And so now I think we're starting to build that infrastructure at the national level. I think the Secretary General just a month ago announced that he is going to appoint an envoy for future generations, which will be an interesting development, and I think in other states they'll start to do that too. But this is where we start to build in those systems and that plumbing to then carry out those things that we'd like to see. And then there was a question that my colleague at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Stuart, who spoke yesterday, asked about capitalism and beyond GDP. So just building on what Mr. Lamy just mentioned, I think, again, you know, we know that, economic growth in the absence of thinking about the impact of that has on the planet, has gotten us into the mess that we're in. And so there are other ways to think about prosperity and growth, and that a lot of it could be about well-being and the way that we're caring for ourselves and the planet and our economies. And so we're starting to build in, what are those indicators? How should we think about economic and national prosperity that is not tied to just how fast we can grow our economies? And I think this is a pretty interesting breakthrough. Now, again, it's going to be based on, how do we do that and are also responsive to people. And so I'd say capitalism can't really happen in a healthy sense without a direct tie to democracy and the agency of people. So you talked about legitimacy, Nicolo. I mean, if we're talking about global governance and planetary governance, Nair Woods mentioned this yesterday, people deeply distrust actions and decisions that are being made too far away from them, and where they're not able to actually see the impact of the policies and the decisions that are being made at the global and national level in their everyday lives. And so if we're talking about well-being and how people then vote on behalf of their well-being, we have to make that connection. Because when you ask people about climate change, that's not one of their top priorities. Their top priorities are their children, their economies, their, what happens tomorrow? Will I be able to put food on the table? Will my children be better off than I am? And unless you're able to tie that to then their ability to make that decision, we're going to be in a world of hurt.
Very good. Just to break up the order here, I'm going to say something about the Summit of the Future because it picks up on this point. I thought that the summit had many positive points, but one of the things that I was most disappointed about was a lot of the language around democracy was deleted from the final recommendations, including ideas around, for example, a global citizens' assembly, randomly selected, which poses the questions of who gets to speak. Should it be one person who speaks on behalf of each of the oceans, or wouldn't an assembly of people be preferable? And that goes for all kinds of planetary goods. One could imagine different democratic assemblies. And it's not just about who gets to speak. It also seems to me to be a crucial aspect of the follow-up. So once something is decided, who makes sure that something then happens? Well, a pretty good motor to ensure things decided is the wider citizenry who holds people to account. That's a tried and tested method. And it just brings me to something I wanted to say about the capitalism point as well, that I'm traditionalist in believing that democratizing work might be an important part of what needs to be done. We have planetary businesses now, which are highly exploitative also of their workforces, and organizing those workforces to hold those businesses to account and even transform the objectives of what they are doing would seem to me to be an extremely powerful thing to do. There are all kinds of initiatives around what's called ecological syndicalism, trade unions which take into account wellness and impact on the planet and planetary systems and so on. And a lot of the most interesting organizing that is being done in that is of people who are working as delivery riders or other of the most essential workers in our systems of well-being. So I think that there's lots of rather traditional answers that we could modernize for a planetary age. Stephanie, Frank?
I can start with the planet of the future. I've been there myself also. I mean, this is, again, the point is, it is a small step in the right direction, but the point is, of course, it's maybe not enough step, but especially the declaration for the youth, I think it's a fascinating development, but it needs to be strengthened, as I said in my earlier intervention. It needs to be strengthened in a way that national governments, national constitutional systems have to be reformed to take better into account the interest of future generations. That can be a council, can be an ombudsperson, can be anything, a legal change to protect the interests of future generations and the interests of the youth. I think that's two different categories. Both are important. Both need to be strengthened. The Pact for the Future is pointing in the direction that it is a decision by governments, but much more needs to be done in that direction. I think that's a very important point. So in a sense, I was there in New York. I was, on the one hand, enthusiastic. On the other hand, I was also disappointed because we don't have that much time, and so much has been deleted also in terms of democracy from the pacts. So it is, I mean, I'm a professional, so I'm no longer enthusiastic. I think it's not going fast enough, and I hope the best. Capitalism, I think, is of course a fascinating point. And I think we have varieties of capitalism, and the current variety doesn't work. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, as I mentioned in my early intervention, 700 people don't have enough food, and that is a failure of the economic global system. And we have tremendous emissions and all these issues. The oceans have been mentioned, climate change, et cetera, so it's not working. We need to have different systems, and I believe that we need a much stronger debate on regulating the economic activities that we have globally and nationally. And I think we have to think much more out of the box. We need to have, for example, meat consumption, typical case, cannot be left to the market, cannot be left to consumer, and we need regulation to reduce meat consumptions in all our countries, and we have to move forward. Like my university, Utrecht University, we are vegetarian universities. I'm not allowed to serve meat to my visitors. When we have a workshop, a conference, whatever, all our conferences are vegetarian and largely even vegan. And it's not only because we like it, it's a regulation from our university, and I would like all universities do the same. Berggruen Institute as a next, in a sense, to have only vegetarian food at these events. Same as flying offshore. I believe we have to ban, at least to ban short distance flights. So easy, just ban them. You have already fewer emissions, trains can be built, need to be built, this kind of regulation. Regulation, I mean, for example, advertisement. I mean, advertisement can be regulated. Advertisement in public spaces, advertisement in media, to reduce the pressure of always buying new stuff all the time, fast fashion, etc. So many regulations are possible, and I believe we need more of them. I know that this is not a very popular position in the current political system in some countries, but I think this is the way forward. And I think the progressive communities have to insist that we should not just step back and say, this is now Donald Trump, this is now Elon Musk. We have to insist also that a different market economy is possible. We should not give it up just because this one election has changed one country and maybe more tremendously. And then the final point, if I might say, is the European Union. I mean, I am in a European, I mean, I live in one country, come from the other. I think it has changed Europe, of course, tremendously. It's a peace, it's an agent of peace. So these experiences are great. And some of the institutions that Europe has set up, like the European Parliament, for example, it has been discussed as a model for the globe, in a way that you have certain power. It's not, I mean, the Commission is there, the governments are there, but there is a certain power for the European Parliament, and the European Parliament takes into account population. I mean, in a way, it's not a total proportional system, but it is that technically every citizen is to some extent equally represented in the Parliament. It's not governments, the size of countries is different. So I think it makes a difference, and it is maybe some elements can be also discussed and explored maybe also at the planetary scale. So I think that is also a great development.
Did you want us to quickly react? No?
I just wanted to pick up on both capitalism and equity justice, and maybe I represent the Overton window person on the panel that's asking what is really the imaginative combination of things that if we imagine the 20th century and the 21st century that we've seen so far is this kit of parts, if you will, of different systems that have worked and not worked in various ways. I think it's, it behooves us to say, okay, we've had incredible dynamism through capitalism, and some of the greatest thinkers of other models have also been aware of that kind of dynamism and the perhaps combination of regulation and innovation that we might need to hybridize some of these models in order to get at the thing that actually works for us. It's much harder to come up with a totally new thing because we're limited both by words and the possibilities that have been demonstrated, as really just think about what is actually kind of interoperably or potentially the imagination of putting these things together in another way. And to that end, I would say that while at this moment, certainly equity and justice are largely realized through resistance to current systems, it would be a real shame if that wasn't at the forefront of actually what we're doing in imagining and proposing an alternative that actually that's baked into those systems, not as a negative function, but actually as the positive driving force of what we imagine those systems to actually be for and do.
I just had a quick response to this point about democracy and the removal of language about a global citizens' assembly in the UN Summit of the Future to make a larger point. We do not need the permission of 193 governments to decide to come together as a planet to do anything about what is happening on the planet. We do not need to have language in a document agreed by heads of state that says, we support a global citizens' assembly. A global citizens' assembly can naturally happen. In fact, it would probably be better off if it weren't sanctioned by governments. So to just this point about national sovereignty and this kind of dilemma that we find ourselves in, where we're tied to and know the constraints of sovereignty on the issues that we're trying to address. And yet we then lapse back into this, well, we can't do it because governments don't allow us. In fact, it should be the opposite. I mean, we should be at the pointed end of the spear in terms of moving forward and doing those things that we know need to happen, and then let the governments follow. That's essentially what's happened, you know, in a lot of the time. So you don't need to have an agreement by governments to put together a global citizens' assembly. You know, it's not going to be an officially sanctioned. In fact, if it's officially sanctioned by the UN, you might not actually get what you want, right? So I think we should take that as a cue for the kind of governance, loosely, that we need, especially in this political environment where we can't rely on states to do the things that need to be done. We need to all essentially step up and find those networks, including those in this room, find those networks and coalitions who can then start to build it. You know, and as it starts to gain traction and you start to build, you know, you'll find that things start to naturally happen, and then governments or, you know, coalitions start to come together to get to the outcomes. Obviously, at scale, it would be better if it were sanctioned and all of that in terms of the impact that it would have. But I actually think, you know, a bottom-up kind of grassroots, you know, action, that's really been the thing that has saved us in the past. So I wouldn't just look to a kind of government-sanctioned, you know, parliament to deal with democracy.
Very good. Look, I think on this point of the optimism of the will, we are going to bring matters to a close for this session. I hope that I hope you found plenty of reasons for cheer and good news in what you have heard. If you were lacking in those, there is the good news that very shortly lunch will be served downstairs. But I want first to encourage you to join me in thanking everybody up here who spoke.